Commander Thrall was bored as he sat at his station aboard the Valorian orbital defense platform, watching the same empty ocean that he had been watching for the past 3 years. Nothing ever happened on Earth because the humans were too broken and afraid to cause any trouble. And Thrall often wondered what he had done to deserve such a dull assignment. These sensors suddenly flickered with an unusual reading, and he leaned forward with mild curiosity to examine the data. Something massive was moving deep beneath the Pacific Ocean, displacing billions of tons of water as it rose toward the surface. Thrall assumed it was some kind of natural phenomenon, perhaps a volcanic eruption or an underwater earthquake, and he began preparing a routine report for his superiors. Never finished that report. The ocean exploded upward in a column of white foam and spray that reached toward the sky like a giant hand, and something emerged from the depths that made Thrall's blood freeze in his veins. It was a ship, but calling it a ship was like calling a mountain a pebble. 12 kilometers of gleaming metal rose from the water, bristling with weapons that Thrall's sensors could not identify and radiating energy signatures that his instruments were not designed to measure. HSS Prometheus hung in the air like a god ascending from the underworld, water cascading from its hull in waterfalls that sparkled in the sunlight. Thrall managed to send a single transmission to Governor Yelmuth before the world turned white and he ceased to exist. Thelina stood on the bridge of the Prometheus and watched the main screen as her ship emerged into the daylight for the first time in 300 years. All stations report ready, Colonel Chen announced, and his voice carried a tremor of excitement that he could not quite suppress. And we are detecting 47 Valorian warships in Earth orbit. Helena nodded and turned to her tactical officer, Lieutenant Commander Okonjo. She said, "What is the status of our main cannon?" Sarah Okonjo checked her instruments and smiled with grim satisfaction. "The Sunfire is fully charged and ready to fire on your command, Admiral," she replied. "And targeting solutions are locked for the entire enemy fleet." Helena had spent decades studying the weapon that her crew called the Sunfire, and she still found it difficult to believe that humanity had actually built something so powerful. The cannon drew energy directly from a contained fusion reaction that burned at temperatures close to those found in the heart of a star, and it could unleash destruction on a scale that the Valorians had never imagined possible. "Open a channel to Governor Yelmuth," Helena ordered, and she straightened her uniform. As the communication link was established, the governor's face appeared on the screen, and Helena felt a fierce joy at seeing the shock and terror in his orange eyes. "What is this?" Yelmuth demanded, and his voice cracked with disbelief. "What have you done?" Helena smiled at him, with 300 years of patience finally coming to an end. "Governor Yelmuth," she said in a voice as cold as the vacuum of space, "this is Admiral Helena Vance of the human system ship Prometheus. I am calling to inform you that Earth is no longer a colony of the Valorian Dominion." Yelmuth's face twisted with rage, and he began shouting orders to his fleet commanders. "Destroy that ship immediately," he screamed. "I want every warship in orbit firing on that vessel right now." Helena watched calmly as the Valorian fleet began to move into attack formation, their weapons powering up with energy signatures that her sensors tracked with perfect clarity. "They are targeting us, Admiral," Colonel Chen reported, "and they will be in firing range in approximately 90 seconds. Helena nodded and gave the order that she had been waiting her entire life to give. "Fire the Sunfire," she said, "and show them what humanity can do." The main cannon of the Prometheus discharged with a flash of light so bright that it was visible from every continent on Earth, and a beam of concentrated solar energy lanced across the sky toward the Valorian fleet. First warship simply ceased to exist. Its matter converted to plasma in less than a heartbeat. Beam swept across the formation like the finger of an angry god, and ship after ship vanished in explosions of light and fire. In 37 seconds, the entire Valorian orbital fleet was destroyed, and 47 warships that had once seemed invincible became nothing but expanding clouds of debris. Governor Yelmuth watched from his palace as his fleet was annihilated, and Helena could see the exact moment when his arrogance transformed into pure terror. "This is impossible," he whispered, and his silver skin had turned pale gray with shock. "How could you build something like this?" Helena leaned forward in her command chair and spoke with quiet intensity. "You conquered us 300 years ago," she said, And you thought we accepted our defeat, but we were never defeated. Governor, we were waiting. She stood and walked closer to the screen, letting Yelmoth see the fire that burned in her eyes every year that we served you. We were learning, she continued, and every day that we worked in your factories and mines. We were building, you gave us access to your technology, and we improved upon it in ways that you never imagined. She gestured at the bridge of the Prometheus, at the thousands of crew members who had trained in secret. For this moment the ship was constructed by hand over 170 years, she said, built in sections across hidden facilities and assembled in the one place your scanners could never reach, beneath our oceans. Yelmoth's face contorted with fury and desperation. The High Council will send 100 fleets to crush you, he snarled, and Earth will burn for this treachery. Helena shook her head slowly and smiled with cold amusement. I think not, Governor, she replied, because I am broadcasting this conversation across every communication channel in the galaxy. Right now, every species under Valorian rule is watching what humanity has accomplished. She paused to let her words sink in before delivering the final blow, and I suspect that many of them are already beginning to wonder if they might accomplish something similar. Helena turned to her communications officer and gave her next order. Broadcast the following message to the entire solar system, she said, and make sure every Valorian ship and installation receives it clearly. She took a deep breath and spoke the words that would echo through history. This is Admiral Helena Vance of the Human Systems ship Prometheus. Earth is no longer your colony. Your forces will withdraw from our solar system immediately. This is not a request. She looked at Yelmoth's horrified face one last time before ending the transmission. Humanity has awakened, she said, and the galaxy will never be the same. War came to the Valorian Dominion like a storm that had been building for centuries, and the Empire found itself fighting against the Kreth collective on the eastern rim of the Galaxite. Kreth were insectoid creatures with hard shells and compound eyes, and they had been expanding their territory for generations while the Valorians grew comfortable and lazy in their power. Governor Yelmoth received orders from the High Council that made him smile with cruel anticipation, and he called a meeting of the puppet government to deliver the new. Shalina stood in the great hall of the governor's palace, surrounded by other human leaders who had learned to hide their true feelings behind masks of obedience and fear. The Dominion requires additional soldiers for the war effort, Yelmoth announced, and his orange eyes swept across the assembled humans like searchlights looking for prey. And Earth will provide 5 million troops within the next 6 months. A murmur of shock rippled through the crowd because the current conscription quota was already draining Earth's population of young men and women. Marcus Webb, a regional administrator from the European sector, stepped forward with his hands raised in a gesture of submission. Great Governor, he said in a trembling voice, we are honored to serve the Dominion, but our current population cannot sustain such a large conscription without causing serious damage to our agricultural and industrial output. Yelmoth's face twisted into an expression of contempt that Helena had seen many times before. Are you refusing the orders of the High Council? He asked, and his voice carried a warning that everyone in the room understood. Marcus shook his head quickly and began to apologize, but Yelmoth had already made his decision. Perhaps humanity needs a reminder of what happens to species that question the will of the Dominion, he said, and he activated a communication device on his wrist. Helena felt her blood turn to ice as she realized what was about to happen. Target the city called Sao Paulo, Yelmoth ordered, and commence orbital bombardment immediately. The screams started 30 seconds later as news feeds across the planet showed Valorian warships opening fire on one of Earth's largest cities. 18 million people died in 43 minutes, and Helena watched the destruction on a screen while keeping her face completely still. Inside, her heart was breaking, but she knew that showing any emotion would only give Yelmoth an excuse to kill more humans. When the bombardment finally stopped, Yelmoth turned to face the assembled leaders. With satisfaction glowing in his orange eyes, the conscription quota will be met, he said, and any further complaints will result in additional lessons. Do I make myself clear? Every human in the room bowed their heads and murmured words of agreement and gratitude. Elena returned to her quarters that night and sat alone in the darkness for many hours, Thinking about the millions of lives that had just been erased from existence, her communication bracelet vibrated with an incoming message from the Prometheus facility, and she opened it with hands that shook slightly despite her years of training. Admiral Vance. The message read, "We have received reports of the Sao Paulo attack. Colonel Chen is requesting permission to accelerate the launch timeline." Helena closed her eyes and thought about her father and her grandmother and all the generations of humans who had sacrificed everything to make this moment possible. Lethe had planned to wait until the Prometheus was fully tested and all systems were verified. But Sao Paulo had changed everything. She typed her response with steady fingers. "Accelerate the timeline. We launch in 30 days. The next month was the most intense period of activity that the secret facility had ever experienced, with crews working around the clock to complete final preparations. Helena traveled between the surface and the underwater base, maintaining her cover as a loyal servant of the Dominion, while secretly coordinating the largest military operation in human history. She met with resistance leaders from every continent, people who had been waiting their entire lives for the signal that would tell them the time had come. Some of them wept when she told them the news, and others laughed with joy that they had barely managed to contain 300 years, said Maria Santos, a resistance commander from South America who had lost her entire family in the Sao Paulo bombardment. "And finally we will have our revenge." Helena placed her hand on Maria's shoulder and looked into her eyes with understanding and shared grief. "Not revenge," she said gently, "because revenge would make us no better than them. What we seek is justice and freedom, and we must never forget the difference." Maria nodded slowly, and Helena could see the wisdom of her words taking root in the younger woman's mind. The final week before launch was filled with tension that Helena could feel pressing down on everyone in the facility like a physical weight. Colonel Chen reported that all fighter squadrons were ready and all weapons systems were fully operational. Yushinton Commander Sero Kanjo confirmed that the main fusion reactor was stable and providing more than enough power for all planned operations. Captain Diego Ramirez announced that the crew of 12,000 was trained and eager to begin the liberation of their home world. Helena stood on the command deck of the Prometheus for the first time on the morning of the launch, and she felt tears forming in her eyes as she looked around at the bridge that her grandmother had helped design. The ship was beautiful in a way that only humans could truly appreciate, not just a weapon of war but a symbol of hope that generations had built with their own hands. "Admiral on deck," someone announced, and every officer on the bridge snapped to attention. Helena smiled at them with genuine warmth and pride. "At ease," she said, "and prepare for launch. Today we remind the galaxy that humanity is not a Tier 7 species to be used and discarded." She took her seat in the command chair and activated the ship-wide communication system. "This is Admiral Vance speaking to all hands," she said, and her voice carried through every corridor and compartment of the massive vessel. "And I want you all to know what this moment means." She paused to collect her thoughts, knowing that her words would be remembered for generations to come. 3 centuries ago, our ancestors faced an impossible choice. They could fight and die, or they could surrender and survive long enough to give us this chance. She looked at the faces of her crew, seeing determination and hope shining in their eyes. They chose to wait, and they began building this ship with nothing but their bare hands and their refusal to accept defeat. She stood from her chair and raised her voice so that every person aboard could hear the conviction in her words. "Today we honor their sacrifice. Today we rise, and today we show the Valorian Dominion what happens when they underestimate humanity." The engines of the Prometheus roared to life with a sound like thunder rolling across an endless sky, and the greatest warship in human history began its journey toward the surface above them. The Valorian orbital fleet had no idea that their world was about to change forever. The stars had never seemed so cold as they did on the night Earth fell, and Helena Vance remembered that night even though she had only been a child of 7 years, when the Valorian warships descended from the heavens like angry gods, demanding worship. Conquest took 11 days, and humanity learned a terrible truth about the universe during those dark hours. They were not alone, and they were not welcome. Valorians were tall creatures with skin like polished silver and eyes that burned with orange light, and they had traveled the stars for 10,000 years. while humanity was still learning to make fire and build simple homes from mud. And Stonefy laughed at human rockets and called them primitive toys, and they destroyed the combined military forces of Earth in less than a single afternoon before broadcasting their demands across every screen and radio on the planet. Surrender or die. Those were the only options they offered. Humanity surrendered, and for 300 years they served as slaves to an empire that stretched across 1,000-star system. Shelina was 94 years old now, and she had spent her entire life pretending to be a broken and defeated woman while secretly preparing for a day that her grandmother had promised would eventually come. She walked through the crowded streets of New Singapore, one of the few human cities the Valorians allowed to exist, and she kept her eyes down like all good humans were taught to do. When their masters walked among them, a Valorian soldier pushed past her without even looking at her face, and Helena bit back the anger that burned in her chest like a living flame, because she knew that patience was the greatest weapon humanity possessed. Valorians had classified humans as a Tier 7 labor species, which meant they considered humanity barely intelligent enough to perform simple tasks and follow basic orders. They used humans as miners in the asteroid belts and as soldiers in their endless wars against other empires, and they took whatever resources they wanted from Earth without asking permission or offering payment. Governor Yelmuth was the current Valorian ruler of Earth, and he lived in a massive palace built on the ruins of what had once been called New York City. He was cruel even by Valorian standards, and he enjoyed reminding humans of their place in the Galactic Order by making examples of anyone who showed even the smallest sign of resistance. Helen had watched him execute her own father when she was just 20 years old, and she had smiled and thanked him for teaching humanity such an important lesson about obedience. That smile had been the hardest thing she had ever done, but her father would have understood because he had been part of the secret. Tooth's secret had been passed down through generations of human families, whispered in dark rooms and hidden bunkers where Valorian scanners could not reach. Somewhere beneath the waves of the Pacific Ocean, something waited, something that humanity had been building since the very first year of the conquest. Helena received a message on a device that looked like an ordinary medical bracelet, but was actually a communication system that used technology the Valorians had never discovered. The message contained only 2 words that made her old heart beat faster than it had in decades. Prometheus Rising. She knew what those words meant, and she knew that the waiting was almost over. Ambassador Catherine arrived on Earth 3 days later for his regular inspection of the human tribute, and Helena was required to attend the ceremony as one of the senior members of the puppet government that the Valorians had established to manage their human slaves. Catherine was different from most Valorians because he actually paid attention to the humans around him, and Helena had always found his orange eyes unsettling in a way that other Valorians did not. Manaji walked through the rows of tribute, food and minerals and manufactured goods that Earth was required to provide, and he nodded with apparent satisfaction at the quality of the offerings. But then he stopped in front of Helena and studied her face with an expression that she could not read. "You have been serving the Dominion for many decades," he said in a voice that sounded like gravel sliding down a metal slope, "and I have always wondered something about your species." Helena kept her eyes down and her voice humble as she replied, "I am honored that the ambassador would think of us at all, and I will answer any question you wish to ask." Catherine leaned closer, and Helena could smell the strange metallic scent that all Valorians carried with them. "Like a signature, your species accepted defeat so quickly," he said, "and you have served us faithfully for 3 centuries without any significant rebellion or resistance. I find this very unusual." Helena felt ice forming in her stomach, but she kept her face perfectly calm as she answered, "We learned our lesson on the day of conquest," she said, "and we understood that resistance against the mighty Valorian Dominion would only bring more suffering to our people." Catherine studied her for a long moment, and Helena wondered if he could somehow see through the mask she had worn for her entire life. "Perhaps," he said finally, "but I have studied many conquered species during my career, and none of them accepted their fate as peacefully as humanity has done." He turned away and continued his inspection, But Helena could feel his suspicion like a weight pressing down on her shoulder shat. Night she traveled to a location that officially did not exist, taking a submarine that dove deep beneath the Pacific Ocean to a cavern that Valorian scanners could never penetrate. The facility was enormous, carved from the living rock of the ocean floor and powered by geothermal energy that left no signature for enemy sensors to detect. Hundreds of humans worked at computer stations and monitoring equipment, and they all stood when Helena entered the main command center. Status report, she said, and her voice carried the authority of a woman who had been preparing for this moment since before most of her staff had been born. Colonel James Chen approached her with a tablet, displaying information that would have terrified the entire Valorian Empire if they had known it existed. The final assembly is complete, he said, and all systems are showing green across the board. We can launch within 47 days. Helena looked at the main screen, which showed the schematic of something so massive that it seemed impossible. At 12 kilometers long and 3 kilometers wide, armed with weapons that humanity had developed in secret and powered by technology that the Valorians had never imagined their slaves could create. The HSS Prometheus, humanity's hidden supercarrier, and the instrument of their liberation continue. Preparations, Helena said, and make sure every person on this project understands what is at stake. She turned to face her staff, and for the first time in 94 years she allowed the fire in her heart to show in her eyes. 300 years ago, our ancestors made a choice, she said, and they chose to wait rather than fight because they knew we could not win. But they also began building something that would give their descendants a chance at freedom. She placed her hand on the console in front of her, feeling the hum of machinery that represented the dreams and sacrifices of countless generations. The waiting is almost over. The news of Earth's rebellion spread across the galaxy faster than anyone thought possible, carried by traitors and diplomats and spies who recognized the importance of what had happened. In 1,000 worlds, beings of every shape and size watched recordings of the Prometheus rising from the ocean, and they saw the Valorian fleet vanish in seconds under the power of weapons that should not have existed. The Valorian High Council met in emergency session aboard their capital station, a massive structure that orbited their homeworld. Like a metal moon, Grand Admiral Thiessen stood before the council, with barely contained rage burning in his orange eyes, and he demanded permission to personally lead the response to humanity's treachery. Give me the Second Imperial Fleet, he said, and I will reduce Earth to ashes. We will make an example that the galaxy will never forget. The council approved his request without hesitation, and within 3 days the largest military force in Valorian history was assembled and ready to depart. 100 warships formed the Second Imperial Fleet, including 30 dreadnoughts that were each larger than entire human city. Thiessen stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, and he studied the intelligence reports about humanity's supercarrier with growing anticipation. He had been a warrior for over 2 centuries, and he had never lost a battle in his entire career. Humans had surprised the orbital garrison with their hidden weapon, but Thiessen knew that surprise would not work a second time. Believed that the Prometheus was humanity's only significant ship, and once it was destroyed, Earth would fall just as easily as it had 300 years ago. The fleet entered Earth's solar system 18 days after the destruction of the orbital garrison, and Thiessen ordered his ships into a cautious approach formation scan for the enemy supercarrier. He commanded, and report any unusual energy signatures. His sensors showed the Prometheus waiting in orbit around Earth, alone and seemingly vulnerable against the overwhelming force that approached. Thiessen smiled with cruel satisfaction and began issuing orders to his fleet commanders. All ships will target the enemy vessel simultaneously, he said, and we will destroy it before the humans can fire their main weapon. The Second Imperial Fleet advanced in perfect formation, 200 warships closing the distance to Earth like a tide of metal, and Dethelina watched them come from the bridge of the Prometheus, and she felt completely calm despite the danger that approached. Admiral Colonel Chen said with concern, the enemy fleet will be in firing range in approximately 10 minutes. Should we begin evasive maneuvers? Helena shook her head and smiled with quiet confidence. Maintain position, she ordered, and wait for the enemy to enter the kill zone. Chen looked confused, but he trusted his admiral's judgment. The kill zone? He asked. Helena pointed at the tactical display showing the Valorian fleet surrounded by empty space. The Prometheus is not alone, she said, and Thesan is about to learn a painful lesson about human patience. At that moment, signals activated across the entire solar system in Luna. Hidden weapons platforms rose from beneath the Surfacian Mars. Defense installations, disguised as mining facilities, revealed their true purpose in Europa and Titan. Human crews who had disappeared from conscription lists over decades took their positions at weapons controls. Second Imperial fleet suddenly found itself surrounded by hostile fire from every direction. Thesan watched in horror as his tactical display lit up with warnings and damage reports. Where did these weapons come from? He demanded. Our intelligence showed no human military presence outside of Earth. His subordinates had no answers, because the humans had hidden their preparations to wealth. Battle raged for 6 hours, and the Valorians fought with skill and determination. That Helena genuinely respected Boot's skill and determination were not enough against weapons they did not understand, and tactics they could not predict. Prometheus moved through the battle like a dancer, its shields deflecting enemy fire while its weapons struck with devastating precision. Human fighters poured from the carrier's hangars by the thousands, overwhelming the larger Valorian ships with coordinated attacks. Thesan watched as ship after ship in his fleet was destroyed or disabled, and he felt something he had never experienced, the bitter taste of defeat. When the battle ended, 112 Valorian warships had been destroyed and 34 more captured. Human losses were minimal, 17 fighters and a single weapons platform on Europa. Thesan sat alone on the bridge of the Eternal Dominion, his flagship crippled and burning, waiting for death instead. His communication screen flickered to life with an incoming transmission. Admiral Helena Vance looked at him with eyes that held no hatred, only weary understanding. Grand Admiral Thesan, she said, the battle is over. Your fleet has been defeated, and further resistance will only result in more unnecessary deaths. Thesan stared at her with confusion. Why are you contacting me? He asked. Do you wish to gloat before you execute me? Helena shook her head slowly. I am offering you something the Valorian Dominion has never offered to a defeated enemy, she replied. The chance to surrender with honor. Thesan was silent for a long moment. As he processed her words, your crew will be treated with respect, Helena continued, and no one else needs to die today. The Grand Admiral thought about his crew, about the thousands of Valorians who were still alive on the surviving ship. Had spent his entire career believing that surrender was the ultimate shame. But now he understood that true shame lay in letting his people die for his pride. I accept your terms, he said quietly, and I give you my word that my remaining ships will stand down. Helena nodded with respect that Thesan had not expected from a former slave. Your word is accepted, Grand Admiral, she said, and I give you my word that you and your crew will be treated with the dignity that all sentient beings deserve across the galaxy. 1,000 worlds watched the BROADCAST in stunned silence. Kreth Collective immediately dispatched diplomats to Earth. Sindari theocracy offered an alien Setwilv. Subjugated worlds began planning their own rebellion. Sheth balance of power had shifted forever, and nothing would ever be the same again. The Valorian Dominion collapsed within a decade, crumbling from within as subject worlds rose up one by one against their former masters. High Council watched helplessly as their empire shrank with each passing month, their military power broken and their reputation shattered beyond repair. They had ruled the galaxy through fear for 10,000 years, but fear only works when the fearful believe resistance is impossible. Humanity had proven that resistance was not only possible but victorious, and that proof spread like fire through dry grass. Helena Vance spent those years traveling across the stars, meeting with representatives of dozens of species who wanted to know how humanity had accomplished the impossible. She told them the truth, that patience and planning and sacrifice had been their weapons, and that any species willing to pay the same price could achieve the same results. Some of them wanted revenge against the Valorians, and Helena understood their anger because she had felt it herself for nearly a century. But she also knew that revenge would only create a cycle of violence that would continue forever, and humanity had not suffered for 300 years just to become the new oppressor. Shwan The High Council finally sued for peace. They expected harsh terms and brutal punishment for their crimes instead. Helena invited them to send representatives to Earth for a conference that would determine the future of the Galactic Treaty of Soul was signed aboard the Prometheus, in the same room where Helena had commanded the destruction of the Valorian orbital fleet. Representatives from over 50 species attended the ceremony, including the Valorians themselves. Ambassador Catherine was among them, the same official who had once suspected that humanity was hiding something behind their smiles of submission. Approached Helena before the signing and bowed his silver head with genuine respect. "I should have listened to my instincts," he said quietly, "when I felt that something was wrong with how easily your species accepted defeat." Helena smiled at him without malice or triumph. "You were right to be suspicious," she replied, "but understanding our secret would not have saved your empire. We had been preparing for too long." Catherine nodded slowly and asked the question that had been burning in his mind. "Since the day the Prometheus rose from the ocean, why did you wait so long?" he asked. "You could have revealed your weapon decades earlier and freed your people sooner." Helena considered her answer carefully before responding. "Because we knew that we would only get one chance," she said. "And if we moved too early, before we were truly ready, the Dominion would have crushed us and our secret would have been lost forever." She placed her hand on his arm in a gesture that surprised him with its gentleness. "Our ancestors chose to suffer so that we could be free," she continued, "and every year of that suffering was a gift that they gave to future generations. We honored their sacrifice by being patient enough to make it count." The treaty that humanity proposed shocked everyone in the room, because it was nothing like what they expected from a victorious power. Earth did not demand conquest or tribute or vengeance. Instead, humanity proposed the creation of a galactic compact, an alliance of equal species working together for mutual benefit and protection. Every species would have representation on a new galactic council. Conquest and forced conscription would be banned. Forever free trade and mutual defense would replace exploitation. And Firth Valorian representatives stared at the treaty in disbelief, unable to understand why humanity would share power that they had earned through blood and sacrifice. Of them finally asked the question that everyone was thinking. "You could become the new rulers of the galaxy," she said with confusion in her orange eyes. "So why would you choose to treat us as equals?" Helena stood and addressed the assembled delegates with words that would be remembered for generations. 300 years ago, your empire conquered us because we were weak, she said, and you assumed we would stay weak. You never asked why we did not fight back. She paused and let her gaze travel across the faces of beings from dozens of different worlds. "We did not fight because we could not win, not then," she continued. "So we waited and we learned, and we built and we remembered." Her voice grew softer, but more intense as she spoke the next words. "We remembered what it felt like to be conquered, to be told we were lesser, to watch our cities burn while we smiled and obeyed." She placed her hands on the table and leaned forward with fierce conviction. "We will never forget that feeling, and we will make certain that no species ever feels it again." The room was completely silent as the weight of her words settled over everyone present. Helena straightened and smiled with warmth that seemed impossible from someone who had suffered so much. "Humanity has learned that power without compassion creates only suffering," she said. "And we did not endure 3 centuries of slavery to become the kind of empire that enslaved us." The treaty was signed that day, and the Galactic Compact was born in the years that followed. Earth became the heart of the new alliance. Human engineers helped rebuild war-torn worlds using technology that had been developed in secret during the years of occupation. Human diplomats mediated ancient conflicts between species that had been fighting for longer than humanity had existed. Human soldiers, volunteers now, never conscripts, defended species who could not defend themselves against those who would exploit them. Prometheus remained in orbit around Earth, a silent guardian that other species called the Sleeper's Wake. It served as a reminder that humanity had waited 3 centuries for the right moment, and that patience had been rewarded with victory. Helena lived long enough to see the Galactic Compact grow strong and stable, and she died peacefully at the age of 112, surrounded by family and French or final words were recorded and shared across the galaxy, we were called primitive. She whispered with a smile, but we proved that the most dangerous weapon in the universe is not a cannon or a ship. It is a species that refuses to give up. The memorial service was attended by representatives from every member world of the Compact, and they all paid tribute to the woman who had led humanity from slavery to freedom. But the greatest tribute came from an unexpected source. Ambassador Catherine, now elderly himself, placed a Valorian Medal of Honor on Helena's tomb, the highest decoration that his people could bestow. She taught us that power is not measured by what you can take, he said to the assembled mourners, but by what you choose to give. Humanity had conquered their conquerors not through cruelty, but through kindness, and the galaxy would never forget that lesson. When other species asked why humans helped them, without expecting anything in return, the answer was always the same: because someone should have helped us. The galaxy had feared what humanity would become with power. They never expected compassion, and that compassion changed everything.